Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the host, chair of Rev 250's advisory group. And Rev 250 is a consortium of about 70 organizations commemorating the story of the American Revolution. And we're really delighted today to have as our guest Professor Frank Cogliano. Professor Cogliano is at the University of Edinburgh, and he is one of the leading authorities on Thomas Jefferson. So welcome.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here.
So what first got you interested in Thomas Jefferson as a figure to study? I mean, you've written 4 books, including The Emperor of Liberty about Jefferson's foreign policy and Jefferson's reputation and legacy. And you also conduct a seminar on Jefferson at Monticello. So what first drew you as a scholar to Thomas Jefferson?
Well, that's an interesting question, Bob. Well, interesting to me, I suppose.
It's interesting
because because it was really an accident, and it was an accident of circumstance, and it was a result of my being here in Edinburgh, in Scotland. So, as you know, I'm a historian of the American Revolution, and in recent years, I've specialized on Jefferson and aspects of Jefferson's life and career. I wasn't originally a Jefferson scholar. When I was at Boston University completing my PhD, I wrote my thesis on anti-Catholicism and the Revolution in New England, for example. So I came to Jefferson a little bit later, and I did so as a result of circumstances. So as will happen, and I'm sure this has happened to you at Suffolk, commissioning editor from a publisher came to visit me in Edinburgh, and you know those visits are always they're half intelligence gathering exercises, half trying to sell you books. And I got to chatting with this editor from a press, which had a series of books on historical figures where they assessed their reputations, and these were short volumes. At that time, I had very, very young children, and my wife who's a general practitioner in the National Health Service here, was in medical school as a mature student. So I couldn't take off to return to the States for long periods of time to do archival work. And I thought, I'll do this short book on Jefferson's reputation, and that'll be that. Because mainly we have the National Library of Scotland here, which is a copyright library right near campus. We've got the University Library, which is excellent. I thought, I'll be able to do this, spend a couple of years working on this. It's something that suits my family circumstances, and that'll be that. Well, that was 20 odd years ago. I wrote a book on Jefferson's reputation for the University of Virginia Press. It was a slightly different book than the one that I originally conceived. So I backed into this by accident. Peter Onuf will be known to many of you and many of your listeners, who's a great Jefferson scholar at the University of Virginia, now retired. Peter did warn me. He said, well, once you start this, it's difficult to get out. And that has proved the case. So what I thought would be just a one book, brief book, largely historiographical, that would kind of be relatively brief, has been now 2 decades. So it was really an accident. But the thing that's interesting about Jefferson and compelling about Jefferson is he speaks to so many of the themes of the revolution, of this age of the American Revolution, and in fact, the age of Atlantic Revolution, not always for good. I mean, we know that, and I'm sure we'll get into that in our discussion, but you know, his documentary legacy is so rich, and he's got a lot to say about a lot of things. And so he's I won't say he's inexhaustible, but there's a lot to do, and it's all very compelling. So it was an accident, but it's an accident that kind of has shaped my career. I guess by way of wrapping up that question, I'd say, you know, I would say to younger colleagues and to graduate students, go in directions you don't expect to go to. They might take you into some pretty interesting places.
That's very true, very true. And you're an Emperor of Liberty. You look at Jefferson's foreign policy, and he's interesting because he is engaged with diplomacy, you know, really throughout his career. You know, you talk about the 1780s, 1790s. Of course, he's the first Secretary of State, but even, you know, before that, and it makes, at least it's made me think about what the American Revolution means in creating this polity in terms of where it stands with the rest of the world. I wonder if you could tell us what Jefferson thought about the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting because on one hand, he is he articulates a vision of what we might think of as American exceptionalism, in the sense that he really thinks the new United States has a kind of lesson to teach the world. On the other, he does universalize it. On his tombstone, he describes himself. There are the three things that are on his tombstone: the author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. But it actually says Declaration of American Independence there. And I would argue that's not a nationalist statement. That's because he thought there would be lots more, and that the United States was at the cutting edge of what would be a global movement, global Republican movement with a small r, that would sweep the earth. And he talks about this in his autobiography, for example, about the ball of liberty rolling around and the tyrants of the North will be defeated, et cetera, et cetera. So he always saw, for example, the French and American revolutions as very much as sister revolutions, the same movement. And so he does have a global vision.
Yes.
Having said that, as I argue in Emperor of Liberty, diplomacy is a very, very interesting school for him to attend. In many respects, it's the university, it's graduate school for him. Yes. And the lesson he learned in Europe was the United States is not very important in kind of strict geopolitical terms or strategic terms. Sure, it matters. And it particularly matters in terms of trade, maritime trade, once France and Britain renew their war in the 1790s. But in kind of global strategic terms, the United States is a minor player. It's literally on the periphery of the map as they see it. But it's not that important in strategic terms. Having said that, and this is where there's a kind of there's always tensions and contradictions with Jefferson. He believes it's incredibly important as setting a moral example and at the cutting edge of global republicanism. But in strategic terms, say in the 1790s, it's a minor player and it has to accept that. The important decisions are being made in London and Paris, not in New York or Philadelphia. Right.
That's a very important lesson. And I was just thinking as you were talking about Jefferson seeing this as a global thing, that last letter he writes when he can't attend the 50th anniversary, that all eyes are opening to the rights of man. He does see this as, part of a global thing, a global campaign. So let's talk, Joe Ellis has said that anyone who's bet against Jefferson in the long course of American history has wound up losing. And, we were just saying before that Jefferson probably won't get as nice treatment in 2026 as he did in 1976 or in certainly 1876. His reputation was at a nadir in the wake of the Civil War. So I'm just wondering, what does Jefferson have to say to the 21st century, or how do we grapple with this complicated legacy?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, Bob. And this is usually where I say, well, the past is my period, not the future. But I can offer some prognostication if you like. Joe Ellis is correct in the sense that betting against Jefferson isn't a good idea, in part because Jefferson is a protean character. So we, by we, I'm talking about Americans, project on to Jefferson whatever our concerns or hopes at a particular moment are historically. If you look at, Merrill Peterson's great book, The Jefferson Image in the American Mind, and the work of Rob McDonald and Andy Burstein that have also looked at Jefferson's reputation in more recent times, what we see is Jefferson, if you will, he's kind of a Rorschach test for whatever our main concerns are at any given moment. So the Jefferson Memorial, for example, is dedicated in 1943 by Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was a great admirer of Jefferson. And that, the Jefferson Memorial, which is a beautiful monument in Washington, D.C., emphasizes Jefferson as the kind of avatar, the kind of apostle of liberty. Because in 1943, of course, the United States was in a global conflict against totalitarianism, and it was on the side of the angels in that conflict. And the issues seem to be quite clear then. And the Jefferson we get in 1943 is very different from, say, the Jefferson of 1963, when the Civil Rights Movement is at its height, and Jefferson's clearly problematic views when it comes to race and slavery come into force. Although Jefferson does pretty well down to the 1970s. I think the bicentennial was pretty good to Jefferson, and the kind of backlash both among scholars and the public is a little bit later in coming, but we've been in a period of revision really for the past 40 years. And it would seem that Jefferson, as we were saying before we went on the air, that 2026 isn't going to be as kind to Jefferson as 1976. I would argue, nor should it be. I mean, Jefferson, we have a reckoning with Jefferson's personal life when it comes to the relationship with Sally Hemings and the enslaved children that resulted from that. We have a much there's a much franker discussion going on about what Jefferson has to say about race in the Notes on the State of Virginia and Jefferson's attitudes and actions about slavery. He's quite anti-slavery rhetorically, but the actual steps he takes are relatively limited. And in a moment such as the current one we're in, where we're having a kind of national reckoning where race is concerned, Jefferson doesn't look very good. And as I say, that reckoning is necessary. I think there are aspects of Jefferson that we need to consider as well. So I think the excised passage of the Declaration of Independence condemning the slave trade. Now, I teach that all the time over here in the UK, and the students' initial response is sort of laughter at both Jefferson's hypocrisy, his chutzpah, and what a bad historian he is. You could blame George III for a lot of things, whether he's actually responsible for everything as laid out by Jefferson in that particular passage, which was, of course, deleted by Congress, is debatable. However, if you go back and look at that particular passage, what Jefferson states, at least in the summer of 1776, he talks about the rights of a distant people being violated.
Yes.
And he is recognizing and acknowledging in his draft of the Declaration of Independence that enslaved Africans, who he sees as a kind of separate nation, have had their rights traduced and violated. So because the usual explanation is, hey, how do you reconcile life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and holding slaves and race-based slavery? Well, one way to do that, and Jefferson does this in the Notes on the State of Virginia, is say, well, they're not humans on a scale on the same scale of as we are. Well, yes, that's one way you reconcile that. The other is to say, actually, that passage in the Declaration, the deleted passage on the slave trade, gives us an emancipatory Jefferson who's actually saying something very radical in 1776 that Congress deleted. But Jefferson's legacy is more complicated than that. He also, of course, changes over time. I think he becomes more conservative on this question as time passes, and that's part of the discussion we have to have. However, apropos of the quote you began with from Joe Ellis, I think the kind of protean nature of Jefferson is such that we need to reckon with we have to take his emancipationist impulses more seriously perhaps than we have. Sorry, let me back up a little bit. For a long time, he was taken at his word. We just said, oh yeah, he was anti-slavery, he believed that. Now we're in a position where we chuck it all out because he's not serious. Clearly he's a hypocrite, etc. It's going to be more complicated than that. And that's the discussion we have going forward. And that's where Ellis is right. Jefferson is always central to the conversation. Because he's so central to the story of the revolution. And I don't think it's going to be a smooth ride for him to 2026. I don't think it should be a smooth ride for him to 2026, but he's still going to be at the center of the conversation, if that makes sense.
Right, I think so. And of course, at that same time, he saw writing the Declaration that he's not in Virginia writing the Constitution, which does begin with that all men are free and equal. They change it. So they create this fiction that these people at some time had agreed to divest themselves of their rights. But you think it's a clause put in to kind of not say something that was untrue, that all men are born free and equal, and yet about 40% of the people here are slaves. But then in Massachusetts, where they don't make that same change, that language that Jefferson uses in the Declaration, but all men are created equal, is what leads to the end of slavery. So I think, as I'm seeing this, they are taking seriously these words. It's not just boilerplate, but it really does mean something, which we know is essential. I'd just like to ask, What is like teaching the American Revolution in the UK?
Oh, it's great. It's absolutely great. First of all, I'm very, very fortunate. I teach at a great university, so we've got great students. 42% of them come from outside of the UK, so it's not as though my classes are only British students, and a large number of them come from the United States. And so the discussions and seminars are great. Scotland is an interesting place because it's we're having debates in Scotland right now about its relationship with the United Kingdom and with London, and being ruled by what they see as a distant, some people see as a distant, overbearing power, central power. So some of the debates in the American Revolution resonate, really resonate in Scotland. And in other times, they're just not, many of the students, they don't buy into the kind of nationalist preconceptions that you'd get in many U.S. institutions. They might have different preconceptions. They're I think, a little too willing to dismiss all the rhetoric of the American revolutionaries as basically hypocrisy dressed. It's basically to hide their self-interest. They're too cheap to pay taxes. Why don't they just pay their taxes and get on with it? And so getting them to take the American patriot seriously is a challenge. But it's really, really, it's really great because we just have different discussions. The discussions, we teach a lot by means of seminars with students. And so we get very, freewheeling discussions with very smart students. What's not to love, really? And they've got a different perspective, I think, than they would if I were at an institution in the United States. But they do have a stake in it. They do feel a stake in it, both because the American Revolution, of course, is an important event in British history. It has, as I suggested a moment ago, implications for contemporary debates within the UK. That usually comes out in the latter part of the course. But also, they recognize, they being the students, that they live in a world where the United States, this is in contrast to what I began with earlier, in the age of Jefferson, the United States is weak. Well, today, the United States is incredibly powerful. And the students, whether they're American or British, recognize, or from elsewhere, recognize that, the United States shapes a lot of what goes on in the world they live in. They were very concerned about the 2020 election. So therefore, the origins of the United States and what makes the United States, to their minds, weird and different and powerful, is of interest to them and also relevant to them. So don't have to make the case for the relevance of it. Our U.S. History Survey course, which I teach on, we routinely have 300 students on that course. So we have no problem attracting students who want to study in the United States. They tend to fall into three categories. There are the ones who hate America and want us to tell them why it's awful. There are the ones who love America and want us to tell them why it's great. And then the best ones to teach are the genuinely curious who think, okay, I don't get this place. It seems like Britain in some ways. We speak the same language, after a fashion. We watch the same TV. We listen to the same music, see the same music, see the same movies, etc. But it's weird and different, and can you please help me try and understand it? And that third group is the best group, actually, and probably the largest group.
Yeah. So how do you explain it?
How long have you got
to take the class?
Yeah, that's right. You have to come and take the class. I mean, I would say, my colleague David Silkenet, who teaches on the Civil War, would say, well, you have to take the Civil War to understand it. You and I are historians of the Revolution. It all goes back to the Revolution. Right. This is the foundational moment. This is, whether it's you've got to understand everything follows on from the Revolution, whether it's the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which frankly is why we still care about Jefferson, to the Constitution and the way the Constitution shapes the United States. That's what they've got to understand. It's the fundamental building blocks to understanding the United States, and I would argue the United States today. That's why it all goes back to the Revolution. So with respect to my colleague David and the guys who work on and women who work on the modern stuff, well, okay, fine, but it's all about the Revolution.
It is. It really.
That's how you understand it.
Okay, so now you and Patrick Griffin are editing a series of books looking at the Revolution in new ways. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hoping to do with this series and what kind of manuscripts you're looking for?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. We are editing a series called The Revolutionary Age for the University of Virginia Press. And we're very excited about this. The first volume, which Patrick and I are editing, we're also editing not only the series, but that particular volume is on Ireland and America in the Age of Revolution. And that's an essay collection. We see this as having sort of three tracks, in fact. And so I would encourage your listeners to please get in touch with me or with Patrick if they have any ideas for books, because there are three tracks within the general series. We have a capacious definition of the Revolutionary Age. So we're basically talking about, I'd say 1750 to 1825, roughly, in the Atlantic world. We're not confining ourselves to the United States, although obviously we're interested in the American Revolution. Both Patrick and I are primarily historians of the Revolution. But in terms of the three tracks, so we want to give junior scholars in particular an opportunity to publish monographs. So we want high quality monographs that will come out with a high quality press, the University of Virginia Press. So we're looking for volumes like that. We also want some edited collections. I don't know how you feel. I'm actually a fan of edited collections. Not everybody is, but I like them. And to some extent, you probably remember the series of edited collections that Ron Hoffman and Peter Albert edited for UVA.
Right.
50 years ago, beginning during the bicentennial and after. And we see these as kind of successors to those volumes. But we also, from more senior scholars, want shorter works that are more kind of wide-ranging, engaging with major themes and almost kind of ruminations, reflective works that might be 60 to 80,000 words, shorter works that are more interpretive. So we have in mind three different tracks within this series, and we really want to encourage people to think about and engage with the Age of Revolution in new and interesting ways and exciting ways. And we want people to kind of play with the main ideas. What is the Age of Revolution? Where is the Age of Revolution? Those kind of, what does it mean? What is revolution? Those types of things. But we're very, very excited about. We've got a number of volumes in press already. As I said, the inaugural volume is coming out in the next few weeks. But we're quite excited. And if anybody has any ideas, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me.
That's great, because it is one of our hopes, because we know about the great scholarship that was inspired by the bicentennial, not necessarily flag waving, but really think of the books by Ron Hoffman's edited collections and a lot of the work we do. So we're hoping this moment will also inspire more people to think critically about this whole period. And so that really happy you and Patrick are taking that into this new direction. So Jefferson is, here in New England, he's not our favorite figure for a lot of reasons. And I've been thinking about Jefferson Pauline Maier says she called him the most overrated figure in American history, which might be true. I don't know, is he overrated, or should he?
He might be overrated in the sense that for a long time, his admirers, who were sometimes derided as the Monticello Mafia, although I think that's a little unfair to scholars who are doing some good work, wanted to credit him with everything, right? I think we've moved beyond attack and defense. I mean, as a Jefferson scholar myself, I don't see it as my job to defend Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
My job is I happen to study Jefferson to try and examine the main themes around the American Revolution and the so-called, the founding. And Jefferson is not overrated, as I said earlier in our discussion, in the sense that the richness of his documentary legacy, the complexity of that legacy, not least his engagement and reliance upon enslaved labor, means that you can't discuss Jefferson without discussing the major themes of the period. Right. And so I think he's a way in. I don't think we need another celebratory biography of Jefferson. Dumas Malone wrote 3,000 pages over those 6 volumes. That's that. You've got that. But I think Jefferson allows us And he's not the only way into this. There are
Right.
other perspectives, and you know the scholars you talk to in your podcast will
Yeah.
adopt those perspectives. There are lots of ways into this, but he is a way in for scholars. And I do think one reason he's worth talking about is the public is interested in him. And one of the things that does fascinate me is having discussions about the meaning of the founding of the United States, the meaning of the Revolution, with the public is really, really important. I think that's going to be an important part of what we try to do as we run up to 2026 and beyond. And Jefferson allows us to do that because the public is interested in him, among others. We don't need more founders chic. We don't need sort of celebratory narratives that just tell us about dead white heroic dead white guys. But I don't think that's what we need to do. And I think we can reach the broader public by doing this. You know, not celebratory narratives, but talking about big ideas, because so he's a way in that way. So I think he's very useful in that respect. And I think, again, this isn't the only approach to the period, nor should it be, but it is an approach. And I think the public outreach aspect of it is actually quite important. And it's one thing I enjoy doing. So, and he allows us to do that. So he's a vehicle. He's a vehicle.
Right.
He's not an end in himself.
Yeah. What do you think he would make of the musical Hamilton?
Well, he loved the theater. And he loved music. So I think he would have liked it. I actually think, and I've talked to friends who work at Monticello about this, I actually think he does pretty well in Hamilton. I mean, all right, he comes across as a bit of a fop, but you know, David Diggs is so good as Jefferson. And as Lafayette in the first act, that it's, you know, What I Miss, you know, is a great song, and Cabinet Battle #1. I mean, so I think, you know, he would have said, "Oh, they got me wrong." I mean, and he's clearly not the hero of it, and he had no time for Hamilton, so he wouldn't have liked that. But he did like music. He loved music and he loved theater, so hopefully he would have enjoyed it. You know, anything that gets people interested in the period is, in my view, is good.
Right, I agree. Yeah. Now, you, of course, your office is in the David Hume Tower, and Hume looms somewhat large to us over this period, and certainly in Jefferson's life. I wonder if you could, and he's someone else whose legacy is a little bit contested. He was one of the great historians. Actually, Voltaire called his History of England the greatest history written in any language. And so again, summing up David Hume in the last 3 minutes is probably unfair. But of course, I was once told that the most important event that happened in 1776 was the death of David Hume. So,
yes. So, I mean, 1776 is quite a year, because we get Hume's death, we get the publication, the first volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, we get the events in Philadelphia, etc. So there's a lot going on. Hume's having a moment. So you say my office is in David Hume Tower. David Hume Tower has actually been renamed by the university.
Oh, is that right?
Because of Hume's problematic views on race. And so we're having a very similar discussion here in the UK and in Scotland to the one that's going on in the United States about when it comes to how we remember the past and who we choose to celebrate and so on. So it's interesting you should ask me about that, because at the moment, David Hume Tower has been renamed 40 George Square, which is its address, and we're undergoing an internal debate about what it will be called, or if it should be renamed or not. So we're having an interesting debate.
None of the Georges had any baggage.
No, yeah, of course, exactly. But however, Jefferson's relationship with Hume was an interesting, relationship with Hume as an intellectual. He hated Hume's history. Hated it because he called it the Toryfied history of England. Right. And he was afraid that if Hume's history, for example, was taught at the University of Virginia, then it would turn UVA students into Federalists and into Tories. So he was really, really skeptical about Hume's history of England, although he did rate Hume's philosophical writings more highly than Hume's historical writings. But he was Peter Odif, the great Jefferson scholar, always says that Jefferson scholars are deeply conflicted about Jefferson. I think that's a good phrase. I would say Jefferson's deeply conflicted about Hume. He's got no time for him as a historian, and perhaps didn't give him enough credit as a philosopher, although he gives him some because of his animus towards his history.
Right, yeah. Yeah, what did Hume say? That he's got the support of everyone except all the Tories, all the Whigs, all the Christians, and all the atheists.
That's right.
Yeah. So this has been fun talking to Frank Cogliano from the University of Edinburgh about Jefferson and other things. Now, you're not originally Scottish. Can you just tell us how you wound up spending almost 30 years now teaching at the University of Edinburgh?
Yeah, what gave me away, Bob? Yes, I'm actually from your part of the world. So
Yeah.
I grew up outside Boston. I was an undergraduate at Tufts University, and then I went to BU for graduate school. I came to the UK in 1992 for a year, what I thought would be a year, and I taught at a small college in Southampton in England in 1992, and then Alan Taylor was my PhD advisor, and Alan gave me advice, which I would give to all graduate students. It's easier to get a job if you have a job. So I got this temporary post in Southampton back in 92, and 1 year there turned into 5. I ended up getting a British work permit during that period so I could stay in the UK. I applied for a job at the University of Edinburgh in 1997 and have been here ever since, and love it. Don't regret it at all. I mean, I guess again, my advice, and I know the job market is very, very different now. In fact, it's an order of magnitude worse now than it was in 1992, and it was bad in 1992. But I would encourage graduate students to think globally when it comes to work. I fully intended to return to the U.S. when I left in 1992. As I say, I left I think with 2 suitcases, and here I am ever since.
Wow.
So it was an accident. But I am, So that's how I ended up here.
Well, that's great. That's great, and I'm glad now, thanks to StreamYard, we're able to talk to you, and we hope we'll be able to talk to you again. It's been a great pleasure talking with Frank Cogliano from the University of Edinburgh, and this is the Revolution 250 podcast, and now we will be piped off with The Road to Boston.